Hi. A while ago, I've asked my viewers to post their questions, and I thought I might do a Q&A session. Now, this is my first time doing this, and actually a lot of the questions I got didn't have to do with specific technical issues on the piano. So I thought I'd sort of round those questions up and just discuss them. So you're not going to see me play the piano in this video. It's not even a video. It's just basically a recording of my voice. And I'll go through some of the questions. And hopefully this will be interesting and useful to some of you. So you can just put on your headphones and go on and carry on whatever you're doing. You can do the dishes and maybe listen to me blabber on in the background. A little bit like a podcast, maybe, although I have no intention of actually turning this into a podcast or treating this as one. So it's basically just me talking about some questions I got and hoping that it will also help some of you further broaden your thinking about music. All right. So the first question is, have you ever taken long breaks, let's say more than a couple of weeks? If yes, did you feel like you played worse or somehow better after, or perhaps no change at all? Now, the answer to this is yes, absolutely. I mean, I've taken long breaks. It also depends a little bit on how you define a break. Is it a break from practicing, or is it a break from playing at all? With practicing, I mean having a daily routine that I follow. And the answer is yes to both of them. I mean, I'm not a musician by trade. I started learning piano when I was 14. And initially I was very invested in it, but I ended up taking breaks just because life. And I can unequivocally say that I've absolutely played worse after taking such breaks. I don't think it's any different with any other profession or skill. Athletics or I don't know, pretty much anything you can think of. I think initially when you go back after a long period of inactivity, you get this feeling like you might have gotten better by a little bit, but I think that's a bit of an illusion. I don't think any coach or any other professional teacher would tell you, sure, take a long break of a few weeks. I don't think any classical musicians do this on a regular basis. It's okay to take a break for a day or two when you have a professional life as a pianist or a musician. But if you want to keep your skills up, or improve them even, you cannot afford to really take very long breaks. Okay, next question. Do you ever feel uninspired and like you've just played the same thing over and over? If so, what are some ways to get out of that mindset? The answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not unique to anyone. I don't know anyone who feels constantly inspired, maybe Mozart. But if you're a mortal, then I'd be surprised if pretty much any musician doesn't have these dry spells. So what are some ways to get out of that mindset? I don't view myself as a pianist. I view myself as a keyboard player, first and foremost. And one of the things that sort of gets me going is buying a new synthesizer with new sounds and new possibilities to explore. When I was growing up, that was when I started playing music, that was in the 90s. And back in the 90s, there were no computers. I mean, there were, but they weren't a part of making music. That only started around, I'd say, mid-2000s on a large scale. So back then, I basically had a keyboard synthesizer. And every few years, I would get enough money, or when I was starting out, I could convince my parents to buy me a new synth. And that would, be a major event in the life of a young keyboard player. With new synths, I'd get new sounds, new possibilities, new ideas. Just basically changing the instrument I played made me think about playing these sounds in a different way. Another thing that is, I think, useful is learning a new instrument. So, if you're a keyboard player and you're experienced and you feel like you're repeating yourself, maybe try picking up a guitar or maybe pick up something unusual, like a flute. Well, that's become kind of unusual these days. So learn something new, learn a different instrument, or try playing with a different sound. If you just play the piano all the time and you have like an electric piano, try playing a different sound. Maybe, I don't know, a harpsichord. Many times you cannot automatically force yourself to get excited and get yourself out of this rut that you're in. So one good solution for that I found is working on the basics. I mean, we all have, I hope, a copy of, let's say, a technique book that we have that we use to work on our technique. It can be Hanon, it can be Cherney, it can be whatever. But the idea is that you have something that is sort of technical and mechanical and doesn't require creativity and inspiration. And when you run out of inspiration, it's a good idea to go back and just stop trying. Often trying doesn't really give you the results that you're after and just makes you feel even more worn out, maybe even disappointed in yourself. So taking the same time, the same sort of period of time, instead of trying to focus on being creative, try to focus on your technique. That's easy. It doesn't require any creativity. Often creativity is periodic. It comes and goes. And you have to ride it when it comes, like a wave. And when it dies out, you have to have something routine to do to cover for those periods of, where you have a lack of creativity. Another good sort of routine thing to do if you don't want to work on technique, you can work on your music theory knowledge. So you can take songs that you like and you can try to reverse engineer them. If you're into producing, try to copy them. Try to write an arrangement or put down an arrangement that mimics the original song. Try to listen what the drummer does, what the bass player does, and copy that. So all of these things don't require creativity, but they make you look at music in a different way. And often if you do this routinely, this ends up inspiring you in some way, making you see things in a new light. Finally, the worst case scenario is just taking a break, and there's no shame in taking a break. There's nothing, unless you're a professional musician, which is a different story. But just take a break, take a vacation, go do something else, spend time with the family, with friends. Don't feel guilty. You can't feel guilty for things that are outside of your control, right? So inspiration is not something that we have any control over. When it runs out, it runs out. Just learn to accept it, and as I've said, it's kind of like a wave. When the next one comes, just identify it and ride it. Okay, next question. What are your practice routines? What to practice as a beginner/intermediate? What are the most effective techniques for practice? So this is a question I get actually a lot, both on the comments to my videos and in private messages, and obviously I got one right here now when I ask for questions in a post I made on YouTube. And I'm sure this is not something that's unique to me. I'm sure a lot of educators get this same question. Now, the answer to it really depends on where you want to get to. I mean, actually, you can answer this question in two ways, because one was about practice routines and what to practice. And the second part is about the most effective practice techniques. Actually, the second is easier than the first part. So let me address that one first. Basically, effective practice techniques are those that are consistent. So consistency is more important than duration. It's more important to practice maybe half an hour a day instead of say, practice in bursts of 4 hours just randomly. So whatever it takes to be consistent, you have to nail down the consistency. And consistency beats everything. It's like water eroding a rock. Over time, if you practice the right things and correctly, and we'll get to that in a moment, over time you'll find that, if you look back a year earlier, half a year earlier, even a month earlier, if you're consistent in your practice, you'll see improvements. Another effective practice technique is taking breaks. And I mean by that, it's sort of the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, or 1 + 1 is bigger than 2. And what I mean by that is, if you have, say, 30 minutes to practice a day, it's better to often break them up. So have like 15, take a break, and have the second set of 15 minutes. Or you can practice 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening. This has to do with the way our brains consolidate learning. Rests are important. Sleep is actually very important. If you want to get better, make sure you get a good night's sleep. This is not just some sort of granny advice or something. This is proven clinically in countless different ways and countless different practice paradigms. Recording yourself practicing is always a good idea. Not every day, every time, but maybe, let's say, 1 day a week. And then just having a listen once you're done. I mean, well, have a listen maybe every week to the recording a week prior. And that will help you assess your progress and see if there are any bits and pieces that need strengthening that you need to invest in. And I know a lot of people don't like metronomes. I think that when practicing technique, they definitely have their place. I wouldn't practice with metronomes all the time, but when building up your technique, definitely, yes. If there is interest, I'd be happy to hear in the comments. I can make a video about how to use a metronome. By the way, that's kind of, I guess everyone has his or her own approach to this. I have this kind of a gamification approach to it. I like to turn it into a game, so slowly increasing the metronome speed and see how fast I can sort of get without making mistakes. And so there are many different ways of using a metronome, but basically just be sure that you use it when you practice your technique. So that was the second part of the question. The first part was what are my practice routines and what should you practice as a beginner intermediate? Well, I don't have any practice routines really anymore. Life is too complicated for that. I have a day job, I have a family, so gone are the days where I could spend 3-4 hours practicing a day. That's not going to happen ever again. Maybe when I retire. But I can give you some advice on what to practice as a beginner/intermediate. First of all, I am a firm believer that keyboard/piano players should practice classical pieces. Even if you don't intend to become a classically trained musician, these pieces have, first of all, they teach you technique. I think learning to play a piece is as effective and possibly more effective in improving your technique than, I'll call them maybe mindless drills. So if you think about something like Hanon or all of these piano exercise books, they're good, don't get me wrong, but equally good are just playing a Bach piece or a Mozart piece or Beethoven piece, depending on the level of difficulty that you can play. Learning technique and how to move around on the piano is, in a musical context, is always better, in my opinion, than learning these things outside of context, which is kind of what Hannon and Cherney and these other books of piano exercises do. Another thing that I think is pretty important is to analyze and think about songs or pieces of music that you like. So let's say that you're a rock musician and you like Radiohead. So what I would recommend you do is pretty much take apart all Radiohead songs that, just all of them basically. Just go to, do the ones that you like, of course, but I assume that's most of them. What does this mean? Well, try to extract the chords. If you cannot, then that's okay. You can look them up on the internet. Try to do it yourself, though, first. Once you have the chords, try to understand them in terms of music theory. Try to identify patterns. Learning many times is a process of identifying patterns. If you're into producing, then try recreating some of the Radiohead song arrangements. Even if you're, let's say, not a bass player, have a listen to what the bass player does and try to copy it and play it on the piano. So reverse engineering things, copying, let's be honest, copying things is probably the best way in which you can learn. That's how people learn. There's no shame in it. You're not being unoriginal. You're learning. You're not going to copy a Radiohead song and pass it on as your own. You're basically trying to play a song that they wrote and trying to understand it, not just play it. If you're a keyboard player and you have a synthesizer, try synthesizing the sounds that appear in the song and try playing the different parts. So these two things, I think, are sort of the main roads I would recommend a beginning/intermediate keyboard/piano player follow. As for specifics, it really depends on what you like. You should play stuff that you like. You should analyze songs that you like. You should play classical pieces that you like. Good starting level pieces. Mozart has easy piano pieces. Bach has easy piano pieces. Even Beethoven has. There's no shortage of entry-level classical piano pieces. Just find some that you like and learn to play them. By the way, a short shameless plug. I'm probably going to record or prepare a music theory course here on YouTube. Maybe I'll make some big, long video, a 60-minute video covering all of music theory. So hopefully I'll get to it in the upcoming weeks, and that will maybe be the easiest answer to want to practice as a beginner intermediate, because I'll try to give actual specific exercises for practicing music theory. Okay, next question. If I learn music theory, will I be able to use this information to play other instruments as well, such as the guitar, saxophone, trumpet, etc.? Well, not technically, of course. Music theory is just theory. Conceptually, yeah, sure. You look at instruments in a different way once you learn music theory. You look for the different chords, you look for that you're familiar with, you look for learning inversions. If it's a instrument that can play several notes at once, you look to learn scales. If you're moving from piano to flute, you're still going to ask first thing, well, how do I play a major scale on this new instrument? So in that sense, it helps you figure out how to approach learning the new instrument. But technically, no, not at all. Next question. What skills should a pianist have to be considered job ready, as in jazz gigs and the like? Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask this question because I've never really been consistently paid for playing or making any sort of music. And I've never played in a professional band. And some of these bands are just amazing. I was in a wedding many years ago, and they took a wedding band, and those people did covers for a lot of famous 80s and 90s and more contemporary songs. And I remember I think there was like something like 10 or 11 players, musicians. I mean, a really high end band. And I remember their rendition of Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer. And I honestly don't think that sitting in a front row in a Bon Jovi concert would have been better than what these people actually played. They were absolutely amazing. And I can only imagine how much practice these people have put into this, not only as individuals, but as a whole unit, just playing together and just being extremely, extremely tight. They were as good as any high-end professional. I mean, they were as good as the Bon Jovi band, that's for sure. Having said that, I can probably think a little bit about what would be considered important for a pianist to know to be ready for jobs. And that would almost certainly vary by the particular style of music that you play. In jazz, it's all about standards. So it's about your ability to get like a lead sheet, the chords and the melody, and to play it. If you're playing solo piano, then that's kind of it. If you can make it sound good, then you're done. But the real challenge is when you're playing with other musicians. So you need to know how to play with other musicians, and this is not as easy as it sounds. Even if you're the world's best piano player, the first time you sit down with another talented bass player and drum player, it will take you time to learn each other. So it's not just being job ready, it's about learning how to listen to other musicians and follow their changes and sort of get accustomed to their playing styles. And good players, they can pretty much adapt really quickly to other players. And this is something that you learn by playing with other players. So you're not job ready in jazz until you've actually spent a lot of time playing with other players. This is actually one of the good things about if you go to, let's say, a college or something where there are other jazz musicians and you play in bands. That teaches you how to sync up with other musicians. So it's not just about playing these, dominant 13, sharp 11, flat 9, sharp 7, flat 7, whatever, these crazy voicings and these fast bebop clicks and whatever. It's more about learning how to play with other players. And there are many examples of very successful jazz musicians who I wouldn't consider to be the top of their field as players, technically speaking, but who were very successful because they knew how to play in the context of a big band or a trio and so on. And I think the first jazz musician that comes to mind is probably Count Basie. I mean, obviously he was a very talented pianist, but I wouldn't put him in the same league anywhere near Oscar Peterson or Bud Powell, or any of these. Yes. And nevertheless, I would say Count Basie is maybe alongside Duke Ellington is the quintessential jazz pianist just because how well he fit into the band that he built. He had this Count Basie big band with his regular players, and he knew basically not to overplay. He gave the other players space and room, and they excelled and showed off. And he would be content just staying in the background and just accompanying them. And his chords, his harmony were not very extravagant, not very flashy. Interestingly, his guitar player, Freddie Green, had a similar mentality, and they were together a very, very good rhythm section for the big band, basically just supporting the other players. Now, that's in the context of jazz. If you're into other styles, then I would say you probably, if you're thinking about being job ready, you probably need to know how to play the standards in that particular field. So, if you want to do, I don't know, if you want to have a wedding band, you have to understand what people usually ask for in weddings and know how to play these songs. So what do people like to ask? I mean, honestly, I don't know. I guess you have to have a style. Like, I don't know, maybe a wedding a reggae band. And so you'd have to know a lot of reggae songs, especially the famous ones. So learning to play standards, learning really how to play let's say, the keyboard parts for famous songs in the style that you're interested in is the key. Everything else is secondary. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be like, this lightning fast musician. You have to have really good. Sorry, my cat moved my mic while walking on the table. You have to be really, really tight. Musically, you have to, know how to sit, play with other musicians, and keep tempo, and so on. Listen to what they do. You don't have to be flashy. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to have like amazing chops in 99.9% of the times. And you have to know how to be a decent human being. So be pleasant to be around and show up on time and so on. I know this is not a musical skill that a pianist should have, but it's definitely a skill that a pianist should have if he or she want to succeed and be job ready. All right, next question. In your opinion, how long would it take for a person to learn the piano well enough to compose their own music? If they spent every day learning the major, minor, sus, augmented, dim, etc. chords, or is this a foolish idea? How long would it take a person to learn piano well enough to compose? The answer is 0. 0 minutes, because you don't have to know piano how to write music. I think the famous example of this is Michael Jackson, who would participate in, he co-wrote many of his own hit songs without playing, as far as I'm aware, a single instrument. He would basically have like a recorder and he would sing into it and then beatbox the drums and the harmonies and so on. I think if you go on YouTube and you look for these, you can find the vocal tracks to many of Michael Jackson's songs, and they clearly show that he was a very talented and intelligent musician. So my answer is you don't need to know any musical instrument. You do have to be musical and you have to practice music. If not on an instrument, then singing. And actually singing is, if you can sing, singing is probably the best way for anyone to learn how to compose music. This is sort of an unfiltered approach to making music, because you're not dependent on your technique, on the ability to play an instrument. You sort of plug in directly from your mind to your mouth without having to, go through the fingers in some way. Okay, so you don't need to practice the chords or scales or all of these music theory ideas. Having said that, I will reiterate one of the recommendations I gave earlier in this video, which is to reverse engineer songs. So it's not, again, it's not about practicing specific parts of music theory, but it's about taking songs that you like and bands that you want to emulate and breaking apart their songs, figuring out which chords they use, the chord progressions, the voice leadings, the parts, what the parts do, and what the different players do, and how it all comes together. Just spending the entire day learning how to play major and minor chords, that's important, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to make you a better composer. Copying other people will. Okay, next question. Whenever I compose a new song, I find that I've made a copy of many songs I've heard all these days. It's difficult to write a new melody that I've never heard. Well, join the club. You know, some people argue that it's impossible to be original at all. I'd say that that's probably a stretch, but it is very difficult. Instead of being completely original, why don't you settle on the second best goal, which is not getting sued when the original artist hears your song? If you can do that, you're already ahead of the curve. You know, there's something about originality as a goal in composition that is kind of interesting. You know, I don't know if this was, I'm not a music historian, so I don't know if this was always the case. When people, it was so important to people to be original. And I think about these, I don't know, I can imagine like an African tribe singing a song together, and then someone modifying the song. And then, you know, the song gets repeated and passed on through generations and gets modified and changes and so on. And I wonder whether they cared about being original. In fact, I would probably say that in certain parts of history, being original was frowned upon because you were going against traditions in some way. In fact, anytime someone is too original, it backfires on them. You know, people don't like things that are too different from what they already know. I'm not saying that original is necessarily good or necessarily bad. I'm just sort of wondering out loud when it became kind of a lot of people are really obsessed about being original or afraid of being unoriginal. And as I've said, you know, as long as you're not getting sued and you're having fun and people like your music and you're getting paid, you know, it's good to be original, but I can think of more important things. This is not to encourage plagiarism. Like I said, don't get sued. Okay, next question. Struggling to tell a story when improvising. Any tips? If my improvisations were words, they'd be gibberish for the most part, not actual sentences that make sense together. Thanks. So tips for improvising, and specifically for telling a story. Yeah, I actually have one very big tip, and the tip is, or I'd actually take a step back and ask you, can you tell a story when you're not improvising? So can you compose? Because improvisation to a large degree is instantaneous composition. If you can't tell a story when you have all the time in the world, you'll definitely not be able to tell a story when you're on the spot in real time. So the first thing I'd have someone do who's, you know, comes to me with this problem is have them compose. And, you know, just take, let's say you're practicing jazz improvisation and you're specifically practicing Autumn Leaves. Just take Autumn Leaves and write your solo. You don't improvise it at first. Just write a solo, and then write a second solo, and then write a third solo, and then do that. And after you're done with 10 different solos, Then we can start talking about improvisation. So you don't touch improvisation until you have these 10 solos written down and memorized and so on. And what you'll find is after you've done this, that improvisation will suddenly become a lot easier, because when you'll be playing in real time, you'll be combining ideas that you've put down when you had all this time, that when you wrote down those 10 solos. And to a large degree, that's kind of what eventually improvisation becomes for, I think, almost all musicians. It's taking ideas, bits of ideas that we have in our heads, and rearranging them in real time. Okay, next question. How do you remember the appropriate scales in fast changes of harmonies, particularly in minor? I get these questions quite a bit. And how do I remember? How do I practice? And so on. When I teach people triads, chords that have 3 notes, so they first of all they learn that there's a major triad, there's a minor, there are inversions, and so on. So there are 12 different notes on a piano, and this means that there are 12, let's say, major chords, and each major chord can be played in one of 3 inversions, right? There's the root form, first inversion, second inversion. So there are 3 forms and 12 notes, which makes 36 forms just for the major chord. Try it. We're not even getting into more advanced voicings and tensions and so on. So if you add minor chords, minor triads to this, that's another 36 forms that you need to memorize. So now they have 72 forms. And this is just sort of the basic minimum. That's the entry level amount of knowledge that you need as a beginner, say. And they ask me, do I really need to memorize 72 shapes on the piano? I mean, isn't there a trick? And the answer is, I always give them the same answer. No, there is no trick. You do need to memorize 72 shapes. And they're actually going to be a lot more. And it's kind of, this is the way it is. There's no magic formula. You just have to sit yourself down and do the work. So how do I remember the appropriate scales in fast changes of harmonies? Well, first of all, can you memorize them for slow changes of harmonies? If you can do the slow changes, it's only a matter of practice for doing the fast changes. And if you're wondering, well, that's, I can do the slow, but the fast is too fast. Well, that's only a question of practice. There's no magic behind it. I also find that when, instead of learning the scales independently in all of the keys and etc., it always makes more sense to me to learn things in a musical context. So, for example, people take Coltrane changes, and that's actually a good way. Learning, first of all, the Coltrane changes themselves harmonically, and then sitting down and working out very slowly at first the different scales and chords and ways that you can solo over the Coltrane changes. And then you're not sort of learning these atomistic individual scales without any context, but you learn them within the context of the Coltrane changes. And that's always going to be kind of the practical way things happen, right? Ultimately, you need to remember appropriate scales in fast changes of harmonies in songs. And songs repeat themselves. So that kind of helps remember fast scale changes or any changes. Another thing that you can do is you can sit down and write compositions that make use of these different scales and learn how to play them. When you actually practice, again, a musical example in context, a composition that makes use of the different notes of the different scales, and maybe emphasizes the notes that they share, or maybe that the notes that differ between the scales, that actually makes you or forces you to think about these things, even when you're playing them fast. So that's another good way to memorize things, again, in context. All right, next questions. I know music theory well, but I don't know how to practice it. Please guide people like me to get into the process. I've kind of given the answer to this during the last questions. The best way to understand music theory after you've learned it, or to practice music theory, is to reverse engineer songs that you like, or songs in styles that you like. So if you like Radiohead, take the Radiohead songs that you like and write down, let's say, the chord changes that they use. Write down the notes, the scales that fit each chord, and ask yourself, why did they make these chord changes? Can I explain these changes using the music theory I've learned? Can I identify the chords that they play? Can I identify the scales? Can I identify the note leading, the voice leading? That's probably the best way I can think of to practice music theory, to actually use it in practice to understand or rationalize or put in context or follow songs that you like. This is something I kind of try to do all the time. When I hear a song, I ask myself, well, could I have come up with this chord progression or idea or whatever myself? And many times the answer will be yes, because I can understand it within the context of music theory. You know, if you have a C major going to an E dominant 7, going to an A minor, then I know that the E dominant 7 is what I'd call a secondary dominant. I've seen it many times. And okay, I mean, it's obviously well placed. And if I like the song, that's great. But if I had to sort of write it myself, I could see myself doing this. Maybe I wouldn't, but I could see myself doing this. The interesting parts come in when something catches my attention. It catches my attention because I cannot explain it using the music theory at my disposal. It breaks the mold. These are really, really the interesting things, or the interesting parts, and I make note of them. I think an important part of learning music theory is not learning just the theory itself, but identifying when people break the rules and how they break them, and memorizing special cases that have caused us pleasure. So I know that C, E dominant 7, and A minor would be a likely chord progression. But if someone wrote down, let's say, a C, a B dominant 7, and an A minor, now that's not a meaningful progression in terms of diatonic formal music Western harmony. But maybe I'll hear it being used in a song in a very musical way, and I'll say, that's interesting. So I think that learning music theory is, first of all, reverse engineering songs, identifying the repeating patterns that fall within music theory that can be explained by regular music theory, but also memorizing things that are unusual, that you cannot explain. It might be the case that if you come back to it a year later after learning some more theory, you'll be able to put it in context and understand why it worked. But sometimes you won't. Sometimes things cannot be explained by music theory, and that's fine as well. You know, music theory is about the cliches. It's about the things that repeat themselves. And it's important to break the mold every now and then. So I've listened to the sound of my own voice for long enough. There were other questions I couldn't get to, and I'll probably do another Q&A at some point. I have no idea how professional podcast broadcasters do this every day. Honestly, I think my voice is kind of faltering at this point. So I can say that I have a newfound respect for people, for teachers, and for podcast professionals and people who have to stand and talk for long amounts of time each and every day. I hope this has been, this has been the first time I've done such a thing. I hope this has helped some of you out. I guess if you're hearing these words, it means you've gotten to the end, and that means that you've stuck through it, which means that it probably did, or it was at least mildly entertaining while you were doing the dishes or something. Either way, you know how it ends. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.